Hi, Xavier.
Hey, Daniel.
Maybe the best way to start is say a few things about yourself, who you are, what you do.
I'm Xavier Leonard, and I work with communities and governments to create coalitions between those two entities.
You used to lead Open San Diego, which is a Code for America brigade, right?
Hmm.
And you're also a musician, right?
Also a musician, yes.
Excellent. I wanted to talk to you about your personal experience. What it's like to be Black in America? What it's like to grow up Black in America?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about my earliest experience, which was I think I was either 3 or 4 years old, and I was still living in very rural North Carolina with my grandparents and my mother. And my there was a little. It was for our rural area. It was just like the only store, but it's like a really small, like shack store. And my grandmother would take me there when she would go shopping and generally, give me back a treat for that. But I remember this one time she was there, and the people who ran the store were white because that was that this is like 1970 maybe. It was really at that time in Robertsonville, North Carolina, pretty much like Jim Crow South, and my grandmother was in the line ahead of some other people who happened to be white. It was a man and woman couple who ran the shop, and the woman told my grandmother to wait a minute so she could take care of this lady. And my grandmother hauled off and slapped the woman for just telling her to get out of the way, essentially.
And
So that
like
happened,
slapped her in the face.
slapped her like whole in the face, and she said, "You're not going to treat me like that." Essentially, now I don't remember all the words, but I do remember that action. And when we got home from the store, my grandfather took me out onto the porch with his shotgun. And he was just sitting there waiting for, like, there to be some retribution coming up the street. I was thinking about this and about this stuff, and I asking my mother, like, why would he have me, out there, at 4 years old? And she said he just thought that was the best way to protect me. Like he wanted to know if something was going down, that he had me in his sights.
And by something going down, he mean like wasn't expecting the police to show up. He was expecting somebody else to show up. Is that correct?
He's, he was suspecting, yeah, white people to rise up and get revenge, kind of KKK style without the KKK.
And he probably thought so. It's not only about protecting you, but also so that you could like maybe to teach you what could happen or something like that, or that you need
No,
to be.
no, I was like I said, 3 or 4.
Uh-huh.
So, I don't know if I would have gotten that kind of lesson, but I mean, clearly it was a lesson since it still is. How much else do I remember from being 3 and 4? Like, there's maybe like 20 experiences that I remember from that age. And
What was happening after that? What were some of the experience after that?
you mean related to that incident or just in general?
Just in general.
Not much that I can remember from that age. I remember, around that time, maybe like a year before that, I was watching TV with my grandparents, and my mother was at law school, and my mother um, had kind of like auburn colored hair. And we were watching I Love Lucy, and I pointed to Lucy and said, "Oh, that's my mommy," because Lucy had red hair. And that was when my grandmother and grandfather were trying to explain to me, like, no, that's a white woman. And I actually hadn't known, like, didn't know the difference. Like, no one had ever made that distinction to me. So even though I interacted with white people, and there was like the people who owned some of the property that my grandparents had worked on, had a son named Yancey, and I used to play with him, and I really um, just had no idea about the difference of race. It took me, at least until first grade to really understand that.
That is really interesting what you said. It sounds to me like a natural state of not seeing a distinction. And so the kind of racial differences are almost like imposed on us by society. And yet it seems to be such a big issue that still divides us in a sense and still brings so much tension, unnecessary tension, in my opinion.
Right, right, right. Yeah, if everybody could stay at that state that I was at 3 or 4.
And I completely agree. I think it's a very natural state to see people as people. Part of the reason why I want to have these conversations is a lot of white people that I know don't realize what it's like to be a Black person today and what are the daily experiences. And I believe that by sharing the stories that keep happening, I think we can bring the attention and more focus, and that will hopefully help us address this issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good work to do.
You graduated from high school in North Carolina?
No, no, I graduated from high school in Pennsylvania.
Like after you moved to Pennsylvania, what was the experience there?
Um,
Was it similar to North Carolina? Or was it different?
it was racially, it was much more intense than North Carolina.
And why is that?
I can't give an answer to it. I just know that it's probably because of the symbiotic relationships that were between the races, after slavery in North Carolina. Even if people were racist, they knew that they had to get along with the Black community because we were all mixed up together. And in Pennsylvania, that was less true. People could go from toddler to college without interacting with a Black person.
So, what were some of the racial tensions that you experienced there?
Not so much when I was very young. In high school, there were times where I had friends, and like those friends would have like a racist grandfather or somebody in the house, and then we'd have to navigate that. There's always this thing that once I'd gotten to middle school in Pennsylvania, there's like a certain tacit known agreement between all the Black people in school that, if something goes down, I got your back. And a lot of Black culture, including like, the making sure that you high five someone, or slap them a soul shake or something. That's like a tacit way of saying, if shit goes down, I got your back.
And how often did shit go down? Like how, or like what I'm trying to understand, was it just the sense of bad things can happen at any moment, or was it really because the bad things were happening a lot?
I know for me, it was just like embedded survival tips that I learned from, even when I was in North Carolina and little, like, I mean, and I guess that like that the lesson at the grocery store was a part of that, right? That was a big part of my understanding about race and the world. So,
Who shared these kind of life survival lessons with you, and what were they?
it was actually more my peers than like my parents and uncles and stuff like that. But I think that it was more tacit with my family, particularly my mother's brother, who I was very close with, my uncle Richard, and my mother, and then while we were in Pennsylvania, uh, she also had a live-in boyfriend. So those were like my three main adult um, influences.
Hmm.
And one way or another, they all had a different take on how to keep my wits around me because at any time shit could go off. Like no matter how many sleepovers you went to your white friend's house for, or how many play dates you had, or anything like that. Like when it came down to it, you're likely to be in trouble with the other race.
And by being in trouble with things like singled out by police.
No, this would be like just entirely hypothetical, but like just know that at any time there could be a white riot, something like that, or somebody could, there could be like an Emmett Till moment, and you could be Emmett Till or whatever, you know.
So that was both in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina that you had those lessons or like those ideas shared with the peers.
Um, actually less in North Carolina because of sharecropping and slavery. There's a different relationship between the races there. And even if people are races, they still found ways to get along and were courteous and mostly supportive.
Let me ask you this. If the sense is that when things go bad, like there might be like a white uprising or something like this, if that's what you're thinking about, then wouldn't that imply that even if people are trying to get along on the surface, at some point of time things start going bad, all this distrust and anger can surface and can happen, even like in North Carolina or something like this?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's probably different now, but um, in some ways, segregation probably helped keep the peace. I mean, there was in
Interesting.
North Carolina. I don't know what people said in their own dining rooms or whatever, but there was not really ever any overt racist incidents that I had.
Interesting. Interesting. So, and then after high school, you went to Columbia University. Is that right? New York City.
Hmm.
What was the experience like there?
In some ways, New York City was the most racist place I'd ever been,
And how's that?
meaning that it was the place where I was most stared at going into shops or diners or anything like that. I mean, there was a really you knew what people thought. They weren't hiding it, and it was just a part of my whole New York experience. Yeah, New York, and I've talked to my cousin about this, who was also around New York at the time that I was there, and we both agreed that New York was like the most racist place we had lived in, New York City.
Are there any stories or experiences you remember, like specifically, that maybe shocked you or affected you in any way that you could share?
Nothing would have shocked me. Well, I remember there was a night that there's a lot of open 24-hour, um, deli contestants and restaurants and things like that in New York.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember going into one with one of my black fraternity brothers, and it was about I don't know, maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and we heard the people in the restaurant, the servers and people behind the counter said, "Oh, we got some niggers in here now." That was never came up in really either Pennsylvania or in North Carolina.
And how often does stuff like that was happening there?
That wasn't happening that much, but all the tacit stuff, like when you walk into a store, you're getting eyeballed without a doubt, right? If I was going into Macy's or something like that.
Somebody is like was trying to watch you, what you're doing, where you go.
Exactly.
Implicit suspicion that you might be onto no good.
Explicit.
Oh, explicit. Okay.
It was
Gosh.
really
Yeah. Yeah.
wasn't anything like, on the sly
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. I remember times I think I shared with you when I was like it came to Germany right after the reunification from Russia. And even though we had the same skin color, it just took me open my mouth and start speaking with a Russian accent. I would immediately be, typecast was, okay, you're from Eastern Europe, you're from a former Soviet Union, you up to no good, most definitely. You either gonna steal something or you're gonna do something else bad. What about encounters with police?
I have mostly had surprisingly good encounters with the police. I can think of this as an example. In North Carolina, so my mother moved back to North Carolina after she retired from teaching in Pennsylvania. She has a house there in a community. Um, I like to walk around that community, and she always, tells me, be on the lookout. You don't know what these folks are going to say about you or do or think about you. Black man walking at night or jogging at night or whatever. And so one of those times I was walking around the neighborhood and I think it was dark, and a police car pulled up on me. And sure, they pulled up on me because somebody had seen me walking out in the neighborhood.
And
But
report it.
right. But my interaction with the police was totally pacific. They were like, "Well, what are you doing? Where do you stay? Do you live here?" And, I was calm and just answered. And actually, I think I had gotten a little bit lost, and they gave me directions about how to get back to my mother's house, and that was it. I mean, the fact that the occasion of them being there to have that interaction with me, there was definitely, some racism behind that, right? From like whoever called, said, "Oh, who's that strange black
And and
person going in
and
here?"
how did you feel in that moment?
I felt at that moment that I could die, actually.
Really?
I felt that, oh, this could be, these people could just come up and shoot me. But that wasn't what the face was that I put on when I was interacting with them.
Is there any difference in like when you interact with a white cop versus a black cop in terms of like attitude and how the conversation goes?
I don't know. It could be off base, but I think my encounters with, I mean, I never had out and out bad encounters with the law. Um, um, but I have experienced more tension, actually, at least with the initial engagement. Like if, like, so say, like I said, like the people in my mother's neighborhood, who stopped me. You know, that was two white cops, um, and and it was pretty pacific once they found out, you know, where I was, who I lived with, and all that stuff. But I have noticed that when something like that happens with a pair or a black cop, it's a whole different vibe.
Can you
And
elaborate on? Can you tell more?
you know, the thing that I would that makes sense in my head, how I see what their interaction with me is like, you know, in slavery times there would be a black person who was like an overseer of the other black slaves. And to me, a lot of my encounters with black police has been like them taking that kind of position.
I think I get it.
It's just not patronizing. I haven't thought about it really deeply, but it's been a part of my encounters with police that generally it's the black ones that I'm more afraid of. Now, that's like here and in Pennsylvania and stuff like that. In North Carolina, you know, I'm equally, you know,
Interesting.
worried when I see some lights flashing at me. But other places, no, it's the black cops.
So let me ask you this. So you traveled quite a bit and you lived in different countries, and then you settled in San Diego. How long ago did you come to San Diego?
1999, actually.
All right. Okay. So 5 years before I came to San Diego. What have been your experience living in San Diego for now 20 years, 21 years? Did you have any racial encounters here in San Diego?
So there haven't been a lot of them. Answer is no. And I think I talked to you about this before, but you know, there was an altercation with me and a girlfriend of mine who was white, and the police showed up, and you know, and I just thought, oh shit, you know, I'm just going underneath the jail now. Um, but they actually saw what was happening and realized that she was the one that was kind of directing, you know, the malice and all that. And I can't remember if they took her away or they threatened to take her away or whatever. But definitely the police were on my side,
Interesting.
which, you know, I just never could, even having lived in San Diego for I don't know how many years it had been, you know, could have been like maybe 10 or something. Wouldn't have imagined that. In fact, once I saw the police come up, I'm like, oh well, let me
Mhm. And it
make that
wasn't
call to mom to get the bondsman out for me.
and it wasn't you who was violent, right? So it was like more of her who was violent in the
Yeah,
argument.
yeah, yeah. She was.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So would you say that in San Diego we don't have racial tension, or would you say that we do? And if we do, then what? How do they manifest themselves?
To an extent, we don't have tension period in San Diego, right?
I guess you could say that. I mean, we do have low, moderate income neighborhoods for sure in
Right.
San Diego, but
Hmm.
overall, I would probably agree that we don't have a lot of tension here.
Right. So I think that that extends a little bit to all aspects of San Diego. So
Why do you think this is the case?
I don't know. I'm glad that it is
Totally agree
because
with you. I'm just curious why. Why is that? Is it because of the weather or the beaches? Or...
right. I was definitely not going to go there. Um, Shit though, maybe it is, man. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe people, you know, it's like do their job because they want money and then they want to go to the beach or something. And that's really, I mean, they're just in it for having a good life and not, they don't have all those other kinds of influences that you have in a place like New York City.
We don't have a lot of tension in San Diego. That is true in many different ways.
People who have been born and raised here might say something differently, but from my perspective, it's pretty mild. You know, I've been looking at the people marching up and down my street. I think like the ratio of white people to black people, you know, in that march is actually higher than the actual population ratio of white people to black people.
So there was a majority of white people in those marches,
Oh, well, of course, it's going to be a majority of white people.
but like overwhelming majority.
Because there's just not enough of us
Yeah,
here to.
yeah,
But
yeah.
um, but yeah, yeah, to be like yeah, like an overwhelming um, majority.
It's obviously great to be in San Diego, but let me ask you this. I mean, obviously, other regions are not as maybe not as lucky as we are. When things happen that we hear about with George Floyd, kind of reminds us that in many other parts of the country, the issues are still there.
Hmm.
And what do you think we're not hearing, or what do you think we might not be getting, or maybe not listening to?
The I think of really black communities everywhere has a lot to do with the echo of slavery. And I don't think that, you know, there might even be black people who don't think about that at the forefront, but the legacy of that is omnipresent and it is making its effect known daily.
What do we need to do to better understand this dynamic?
I don't know. I think that's a hard task. And I think I don't know. I'm inclined to say that there are things and experiences that can't always be shared to people who aren't experiencing it. Yeah, you can talk about it, you can have seminars, you can write papers, but the lived in spirit experience is so much more subtle and yet can be devastating. It can rise to like a, you know, a devastating point, like in a minute. It's always there. You know, it's always, no matter how long things have been good or pacific, there's always that chance. I mean, I think I know it's something that I live with, not as much as maybe people who aren't in San Diego, black people who aren't in San Diego, but still, even when, you know, with these specific marches, I was thinking, man, well, if some shit goes down, you know, there's going to be somebody attacking black people.
I think it's very important to talk about that and to understand that.
But that's also just like an everyday thing. It's not just for like these special occasions. That's I know I do, and I would assume there are others in my position who never forget that at any point, you know, something can go down.
When these things happen, it kind of brings it all up on the surface, almost re traumatizes. And then we start asking ourselves a question, okay, how can we heal some of these wounds? And maybe one thing to understanding that you and I talked about was that a lot of people might not necessarily quite get the notion of privilege. And as I was also talking to Bill and some others about that, it's very hard to understand a notion of privilege if you've never been discriminated in your whole life. You don't know what the whole talk about privilege is about. But let me ask you, what does white privilege mean to you, and how do you feel about that?
It just means to me that to get the same benefits out of a job or life or a restaurant, I have to be 30% better than white people or something, whatever the metric is.
So basically, it's a notion that the white people can get away with a lot more stuff.
Yeah, get away is kind of that puts it in a box. I just
Okay.
say they have just a different category of stress. We have an extra category of stress that I don't think they do.
That would make, in my opinion, that would make somebody very angry over time. Having this chronic stress would make some people very angry. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
That is, I think, what brings this unnecessary tension in our communities and our society. That I think, as you said, it's really hard to convey your experience and or share your experience with other people that never had those experiences. Let me ask you this question. What do you think is the Black community overall doing to have their voice heard? And do you think there's enough happening of that? And so that
Oh,
some of this sense of tension, fear, of anger, of stress, how much is happening to share that?
I think very little.
Why do you think this is the case?
When I was doing this fellowship in Africa in Cote d'Ivoire, one of the friends that I made was a pretty poor person there by standards for that community, but conversed with him and gone to like these little bars where people make their own alcohol like on the street and drank with them like that. And I remember we were coming back from a place like that. He was speaking in French and he referred to me as Le Blanc. I was like, wait, what? Like not as just because that's what he considered that I was because of like my access that I had and relative to him the money that I had put me right and in the white man box for
So it
him.
was purely because he saw you like a rich American kid that's in Africa. What about the United States? My experience with Black history actually was back in the Soviet Union, where we were reading the Uncle Tom's Hut. Coming here, I saw some documentaries and it's about March in Washington. Just recently watched I'm Not Your Negro based on James Baldwin. The schools have like Black History Month. I feel like, okay, if you're really, really curious, you can learn a lot about the topic. But if you're just living your life, you're probably not hearing the voice very well of what's going on. And maybe you know about the history, you're not getting the sense of stress, you're not getting the sense of tension, you're not getting the sense of anger. Why do you think this is the case? And what could be done to...
I'm not so sure that I agree with what you see as a deficit.
Please elaborate.
I mean, I just see so many strong elders and leaders in the community. I think that those conversations are happening, and I think that they're. Tell me more about what you think is lacking.
Based on what you just said a few minutes ago, if I understood you correctly, the voices are not necessarily being heard by the white people. People who I respect saying things like all lives matter, which is true, right? But that's not the point. Or murder of George Floyd wasn't racially driven, is just an example of police brutality overall in general. The more I hear stuff like that, the more it makes me think these people don't really understand what the issue is at stake. It kind of goes back a little bit back to what you and I talked about a couple of days ago, which was it's not because of ill intent, it's just because of ignorance. People just don't know and don't understand and don't see. Okay, if that's the case, there must be something missing. And what is that is missing? And how do we bring it to their attention?
I don't know that I would jump aboard that platform that you just described. I'm not so sure that that is the most salient thing to do. Like I think that it's fine for community, and in this case, we're talking about the Black community, to have conversations and come to understandings that other people out in other communities don't. I don't think that that's wrong necessarily. In fact, I think that it's a part of strength. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is, I would say, like the people that you're talking about who don't get it or whatever, or aren't, I don't know what you would call it. They're missing something. It's not hard to find, if they want it to. I don't think the transmission of knowledge or practice from the Black community to other communities, I don't think that's the barrier.
Tell me more about what you just said about the power of the conversation that's happening inside the Black community that doesn't necessarily need to be shared with. I think if I understood you correctly,
Mm-hmm.
I thought there was
Um,
a profound thought. I just like to understand it better.
I'm just saying that we are always going to be underdogs. Like things may get better and better, but there's still going to be a gap because it's kind of built into the machine, right? Like so much would have to change. Um,
But does it have to be? Does it have
what?
to be? Let me just shut up for a moment and let you finish your thought.
And I'm saying that I don't agree that like everything can be solved. And I think that a part of that is that everybody who has privilege, all groups, all ethnic groups or whatever, I mean, they want to keep what they've got. And really to get to a meaningful understanding, have to relinquish that privilege. I'm not saying that people should, but I think that without doing that, then you can't get to that kind of nitty gritty within the Black community.
I see. It's just, I think that we don't necessarily need to relinquish the privilege. It's not about giving up your privilege. It's about making sure that it's not privilege at all. It becomes a normal human behavior for not being eyeballed in a store, not being singled out by police, or not being like feeling threatened just because of who you are. It shouldn't be considered a privilege. It's like just a basic form that the society should exist, that people don't feel stressed out on the regular basis. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make. And of course, those things can't happen overnight, and you cannot just pass a law and make them go away, but you can strive for them, and you can believe in them, and you can put an effort to create the society where it's not an issue anymore. So that's kind of the world that I would like to live. It is possible. There are other countries where it is possible. It can be done.
I would say that I don't see a pathway for where folks would relinquish enough of their privilege to attain what you're talking about.
Let me ask you this. We covered a lot of ground. It's been like about an hour, and really appreciate it. I think we got to some really important things that we talked about. What do you think we haven't covered, or we haven't talked? What do you think I might be missing?
Hopefully, a little bit with these demonstrations or whatever, right? You create some common soil, kind of, right? Like
Yeah,
like where you can plant ideas and they're going to grow in white people's garden and Latino people's garden and Black people's garden, right? Some of
yeah,
that is going to
yeah.
happen. There's also a place for those groups of people to deal with their own shit, right? And I think that that's fine too. And I think that you can't get to some real semblance of equality unless, particularly the people who have the most privilege aren't addressing themselves, right? And addressing what the dynamic is between them and the rest of the world. And I think that's more important.
I think that makes sense. I think it's a process, but I think it's very important for us to understand and to listen and to pay attention. Yeah.
I can't remember her name, but there was like a little girl who was, one of these victims to police. It was a Black girl, and I just can't even imagine if that were a white girl, right? Just can't even imagine it happening. And if it did, what would be the response to the of the community, right? Of like the white community would be like hell on leash, I think.
I can probably look
Um,
it up, but what was what happened?
she was just killed. She was out playing at the wrong time, and it was another killing by cop.
I'll try to find it. Well, I think we could have talked for another, I don't know. We only touched upon anger and fear. And I was just thinking the other day that a lot of this kind of maintaining a privilege and dominance and everything is very often is driven by fear that if I'm not dominant enough, or if not exercising my privilege, the things are going to turn and the other side is going to take the upper hand, and then I'm going to be the discriminated one. It's kind of like a zero-sum game thinking. If not them, then it's us. I think unfortunately that's what there is a lot of people, or quite a few people, thinking, and it doesn't have to be that way. Hey, Xavier, really appreciate your time. Thanks for finding the time, and thanks for speaking openly and really opening up and sharing your views. It's really important. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for providing the opportunity.